The American Yawp, Chapter 12, The National Crisis, Section 4, Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men. In March 1849, Abraham Lincoln returned home from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, presumably to resume a quiet life as a prairie lawyer. Having been defeated after just one term in Congress as a critic of the Mexican War, his political prospects appeared dim, and, like many others, Lincoln may have expected never to return to the national stage. Yet, events in the early 1850s prepared the groundwork for his dramatic political comeback. The political realities unleashed by the Mexican War fast evolved during the early 1850s as Lincoln returned to Springfield. President Zachary Taylor remained in office only a brief time until his unexpected death from a stomach ailment in 1850. During Taylor's brief time in office, the seeming fruits of the Mexican War began to spoil. When Taylor was alive, his administration struggled to find a good remedy. Increased clamoring for the admission of California, New Mexico, and Utah pushed the country closer to the edge, as the question of slavery's expansion again proved nearly irreconcilable. As we have seen, gold had also been discovered by this time in California, and as thousands continued to pour into the West Coast and through the trans-Mississippi West, the admission of new states and territories loomed. In Utah, Mormons were making claims to an independent state they called Deseret. By 1850, California wanted admission as a free state. With so many competing dynamics underway, and with the president dead and replaced by Whig Millard Fillmore, the 1850s were off to a chaotic start. Congressional leaders like Henry Clay and newer legislators like Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois were asked to broker a compromise. But this time it was clear no compromise could bridge all the diverging interests at play in the country. Clay eventually left Washington, disheartened by the affairs. It fell to young Stephen Douglas, then, to shepherd the bills through Congress, which he, in fact, did. Legislators rallied behind the Compromise of 1850, an assemblage of bills passed late in 1850, which managed, briefly, to keep the promises of the Missouri Compromise alive. The Compromise of 1850 tried to offer something to everyone, but in the end, it only worsened the sense of rising national crisis. For leaders in the slaveholding states, the package offered a tough, new fugitive slave law that empowered the federal government to deputize regular citizens in arresting runaways. The New Mexico Territory and the Utah Territory would also be allowed to determine their own fates as slave or free states based on the concept of popular sovereignty. The compromise also allowed territories to submit suits directly to the Supreme Court over the status of freedom-seeking people within their bounds. Those of an anti-slavery persuasion were less impressed with the terms of the deal. The proposed admission of California as a free state cheered many anti-slavery Northerners, but even the admission of a vast new state full of resources and rich agricultural lands seemed inadequate to the losses the Compromise Bill entailed. In addition to California, Northerners also pressed for a ban on the slave trade in Washington, D.C. As a further proposed consolation prize, Texas, which had already come into the Union as a slave state, was asked to give some of its land to New Mexico in return for the federal government absorbing some of the former republic's debt. But the compromise debates failed to really please anyone, and the situation soon grew desperate and grim. It appeared increasingly likely that the nation was headed toward a civil war. The change in the nation's political rhetoric after 1850 was in many ways palpable. After the Compromise of 1850, anti-slavery critics, for example, became increasingly certain that enslavers had co-opted the federal government, and that a Southern slave power secretly controlled Washington, where it hoped to make slavery a national institution. These complaints also pointed back to how the 3/5 compromise of the Constitution gave Southerners proportionally more representatives in Congress. Anti-slavery leaders increasingly argued, in short, that Washington worked on behalf of enslavers while ignoring the interests of white working men. Of all the measures included in the Compromise of 1850, however, none proved more troubling to anti-slavery Americans than the Fugitive Slave Act. While a legal obligation to return escaped enslaved people had existed since the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, the 1850 law significantly expanded the federal government's enforcement powers. The Fugitive Slave Act was a direct attempt to extend slavery's reach across the entire country. It established a system of special federal commissioners who were authorized to determine the status of alleged fugitives without granting them a jury trial or allowing them to testify in their own defense. Local authorities were barred from interfering in the capture of freedom seekers under any circumstances. Even private citizens were required to assist in the arrest of so-called fugitive slaves when called upon by federal agents, regardless of their personal views on slavery. In this way, The law laid the foundation for a sweeping expansion of federal authority, especially its police powers, and it marked a serious disruption of American federalism. Many were especially alarmed by how the law directly undermined their local and state legal protections. The response to the law was swift and intense. It inflamed anti-slavery sentiment and deepened public mistrust of the federal government, particularly due to the law's built-in incentives for corruption. Federal commissioners, for example, were paid $10 if they ruled that the accused was enslaved, but only $5 if they ruled in favor of the accused's freedom. The law also emboldened a growing industry of kidnappers who worked alongside local authorities to abduct and re-enslave free black Northerners. Free black communities responded with heightened militancy and resistance. Many individuals fled to Canada, while others organized to defend their communities, sometimes using force. Across the North, desperate but determined confrontations between residents and federal authorities became increasingly common, as resistance to the law took on both legal and physical forms. 2-1. With widespread disaffection toward the government now spreading, the first major political victim came in the 1852 presidential election. The election dealt the Whig Party a stunning defeat and effectively ended their existence as a national political party. Whigs captured just 42 of the 254 electoral votes needed to win. A peaceful resolution to the Mexican War had seemed, however, briefly in reach. Now, the two-party system appeared to be in shambles. Anti-slavery resentment at the terms of the compromise debates continued to run deep as the Whigs crumbled. One measure of the enduring popularity of anti-slavery ideas came during the election cycle in 1852, when Harriet Beecher Stowe published her best-selling anti-slavery novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Sales for Uncle Tom's Cabin made it one of the best-selling books in American history, eclipsed only by sales of the Bible. The book became a sensation and helped move anti-slavery again into everyday conversation. Despite the powerful anti-slavery message, Stowe's book also reinforced many racist stereotypes, however. Democrats were themselves, by 1853, also badly splintered along sectional lines over slavery. Yet the Democrats also had more reason to act with confidence than their rivals, the Whigs. Voters had, after all, returned the Democrats to majorities in 1852, following the bitter fights over the Compromise of 1850. Emboldened, Senator Douglas again introduced a set of additional amendments to a bill drafted in late 1853 to help organize the Nebraska Territory, the last of the still unorganized portion of what had been the Louisiana Purchase lands. In 1853, that territory was huge. It extended from the northern end of Texas to the Canadian border, encompassing present-day Nebraska, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, Colorado, and Montana. Douglas's efforts to amend and introduce the bill in 1854 opened dynamics that would break the Democratic Party in two, and, in the process, rip the country apart. Douglas's formidable Democratic Party coalition, as it emerged in 1852, had traditionally served as the partisan home for the nation's swelling ranks of immigrants. More than 5 million immigrants, in fact, arrived in the United States between 1820 and 1860. Irish, German, and Jewish incomers sought new lives and economic opportunities. By the Civil War, nearly 1 out of every 8 Americans had been born outside the United States. A series of push and pull factors drew these new arrivals to the United States. In England, for example, an economic slump prompted Parliament to modernize British agriculture by revoking common land rights for Irish farmers. These policies generally targeted Catholics in the southern counties of Ireland and motivated many to seek greater opportunity elsewhere. The booming American economy pulled Irish immigrants toward ports along the eastern United States. Between 1820 and 1840, over 250,000 Irish immigrants arrived in the United States. Without the capital and skills required to purchase and operate farms, Irish immigrants settled primarily in northeastern cities and towns and performed unskilled work. Irish men usually emigrated alone and, when possible, practiced what became known as chain migration. Chain migration allowed Irish men to send portions of their wages home, which would then be used either to support their families in Ireland or to purchase tickets for relatives to come to the United States. Irish immigration followed this pattern into the 1840s and 1850s, when the infamous Irish famine sparked a massive exodus out of Ireland. Between 1840 and 1860, 1.7 million Irish fled starvation and the oppressive English policies that accompanied it. 24. As they entered manual, unskilled labor positions in urban America's dirtiest and most dangerous occupations, Irish workers in northern cities were compared to African Americans, and anti-immigrant newspapers portrayed them with ape-like features. Despite this hostility, Irish immigrants retained their social, cultural, and religious beliefs, and left an indelible mark on American culture. While the Irish settled mostly in coastal cities, most German immigrants used American ports and cities as temporary waypoints before settling in the rural countryside. Over 1.5 million immigrants from the various German states arrived in the United States during the antebellum era. Although some southern Germans fled declining agricultural conditions and repercussions of the liberal revolutions of 1848, many Germans simply sought steadier economic opportunity. German immigrants tended to travel as families and carried with them skills and capital that enabled them to enter middle-class trades. Germans migrated to the Old Northwest to farm in rural areas and practiced trades in growing communities such as St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Milwaukee, three cities that formed what came to be called the German Triangle. These Catholic and Jewish Germans transformed many areas of the Republic during the 1850s. New York's Jewish population, for example, rose from approximately 500 in 1825 to 40,000 in 1860. Similar gains were seen in other American cities. Jewish immigrants hailing from southwestern Germany and parts of occupied Poland moved to the United States through chain migration and as family units. Unlike other Germans, Jewish immigrants rarely settled in rural areas. Once established, Jewish immigrants found work in retail, commerce, and artisanal occupations such as tailoring. They quickly found their footing and established themselves as an important part of the American market economy. Just as Irish immigrants shaped the urban landscape through the construction of churches and Catholic schools, Jewish immigrants erected synagogues and made their mark on American culture as well. The Democrats counted on the support of this broad-based and multifaceted immigrant constituency as it set out to consolidate its power and national grip in the mid-1850s. Douglas proposed a bold plan in 1854 to cut off a large southern chunk of Nebraska as the Kansas Territory, where popular sovereignty, he said, would flourish. Douglas had several goals in mind. The expansionist Democrat wanted to organize the territory to facilitate the completion of a national railroad that would flow through Chicago. It would bring a broadly consolidated national economy that would link all of the new states and territories, east and west. But before he had even finished introducing the bill, an anti-slavery opposition that suspected that all of this would also come with slavery's expansion into these lands had already started to mobilize in response. Salmon P. Chase, one of the few resolutely anti-slavery leaders in the Senate at the time, drafted a response in northern newspapers in January 1854 that framed the Kansas-Nebraska bill as a measure to overturn the Missouri Compromise and open western lands for slavery. Kansas-Nebraska protests emerged in response throughout the North that spring, with key meetings in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Maine. In the territories, meanwhile, legislators decided Kansas would become slave or free depending on the result of local elections. This, in turn, led to a dangerous situation wherein migrants flooding to the territory swelled the ranks of those who planned to vote for either expanding or constricting slavery. Making matters worse, many of these migrants traveled to Kansas with stockpiles of weapons and munitions suitable for war. Ordinary Americans, meanwhile, increasingly resisted what they now believed to be a pro-slavery federal government. The rescues and arrests of enslaved men like Anthony Burns in Boston and Joshua Glover in Milwaukee in the spring and early summer of 1854 signaled the rising vehemence of resistance to the nation's 1850 fugitive slave law. The case of Anthony Burns, as an example, illustrates how the fugitive slave law radicalized the slavery issue in the eyes of many voters. On May 24, 1854, 20-year-old Burns, a preacher who worked in a Boston clothing shop, was clubbed and dragged to jail. 1 year earlier, Burns had escaped slavery in Virginia, and a group of slave catchers had since come north to return him to Richmond. Word of Burns's capture spread, and a mob gathered outside the courthouse demanding Burns's release. 2 days after the arrest, the crowd stormed the courthouse and shot a deputy U.S. Marshal to death. News reached Washington, and the federal government sent soldiers. Boston was placed under martial law. Federal troops lined the streets of Boston as Burns was marched onto a ship, where he was sent back to slavery in Virginia. After spending over $40,000, the U.S. government successfully re-enslaved Burns. For many white Northerners after the summer of 1854, there was no going back to a moderate stance on the issue. In the words of Amos Adams Lawrence, "We went to bed one night old-fashioned, conservative, compromise Union Whigs and woke up stark mad abolitionists." As Americans on all sides of the political spectrum radicalized, organizations like the New England Emigrant Aid Company provided still more guns and other goods for those willing to go to Kansas and establish the territory as anti-slavery through their votes. The year 1855 then nearly fractured the Northern anti-slavery coalition, threatening to splinter it into disparate parts. The growing influx of immigrants, particularly Catholic Germans and Irish, triggered a backlash among many native-born Anglo-Protestant Americans. In response, a resurgent anti-immigrant movement briefly seized the momentum of the collapsing Whig Party and redirected political frustration away from the administration and toward the perceived threat posed by immigrant communities in American cities. This nativist movement gained popularity in places with large Catholic populations, such as Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia, and even launched its own political party. Known informally as the Know-Nothings, the group's formal name was the American Party. They achieved notable electoral success in 1854 and 1855, especially in New England and the Mid-Atlantic states. Yet, despite these gains, the anti-immigrant movement failed to resonate in the increasingly immigrant-rich American West, where anti-slavery politics remained far more compelling. At the same time, the anti-slavery movements that started in the early part of 1854 coalesced with the formation of a new political party by the summer and fall of 1854. Harking back to the Founding Fathers, its organizers named it the Republican Party. The Republicans had several advantages over the Know-Nothings in their attempts to become the nation's second party alternative to the Democrats. For one, the slavery issue remained as volatile as ever, and unlike immigration, it led to some spectacularly violent and unsettling episodes in 1855. Following an explosive speech before Congress on May 1920 of that year, for example, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts was violently beaten with a cane by Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina on the floor of the Senate chamber. Among other accusations, Sumner had accused Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, Brooks's cousin, of defending slavery so he could have sexual access to black women. Brooks felt that he had to defend his relative's honor and nearly killed Sumner in response. The violence in Washington was shocking enough, but it paled in comparison to what was soon underway in Kansas. Pro-slavery raiders attacked Lawrence, Kansas. Radical abolitionist John Brown retaliated, murdering several pro-slavery Kansans. As all of this played out, the House also failed to expel Brooks from his congressional seat. Brooks resigned his position anyway, only to be re-elected by his constituents later in the year. He received new canes emblazoned with the words, "Hit him again." With sectional tensions at a breaking point, a fair case could be made that the country had already descended into civil war. In this climate, both parties readied for the coming presidential election in 1856. In June, the newly named Republican Party held its nominating convention at Philadelphia and selected Californian John Charles Fremont. Fremont's anti-slavery credentials may not have pleased many abolitionists, but his dynamic and talented wife, Jessie Benton Fremont, appealed to more radical members of the coalition, while John Fremont's former Democratic Party ties and role in the California campaign pleased the coalition's more conservative wings. As a self-professed moderate Whig, Abraham Lincoln was slow to abandon his old party for the Fremont-led ticket. But by the summer of 1856, Lincoln had also fully committed himself to the Fremont campaign and the Republican Party. Fremont lost the election in 1856, much to the horror and disappointment of the anti-slavery movement. But Republicans celebrated that he won 11 of the 16 free states. This showing, they urged, was truly impressive for any party making its first run at the presidency. Yet, Northern Democrats, unhappy with their party's pro-slavery turn in crucial swing states, remained unmoved by the Republican Party's appeals. Ulysses S. Grant of Missouri, for example, a Mexican war veteran, worried that Fremont and the Republicans signaled trouble for the Union itself. Grant voted for the Democratic candidate, James Buchanan, believing a Republican victory might bring about disunion. In abolitionist, and especially Black American circles, Fremont's defeat was more than a disappointment. Believing their fate had been sealed as permanent non-citizens, some African Americans considered foreign emigration and colonization. Others began to explore the option of more radical and direct action against slave power. Section 5, From Sectional Crisis to National Crisis. The events in the middle 1850s motivated many Northerners to re-engage with politics, and among the most prominent was Abraham Lincoln. In a speech delivered in Peoria, Illinois, in October 1854, Lincoln laid out his objections to slavery's expansion with such clarity, logic, and moral force that the address became a foundational statement of his anti-slavery position, one that drew in scores of similarly minded Northerners for years to come. The speech also played a crucial role in reviving his political career. 2 years later, during an 1856 speech in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Abraham Lincoln continued to assure his audience that the country's commercial transformation had not reduced American laborers to slavery. Southerners, he said, insist that their slaves are far better off than Northern freemen. What a mistaken view do these men have of Northern laborers. They think that men are always to remain laborers here, but there is no such class. The man who labored for another last year, this year labors for himself, and next year he will hire others to labor for him. This essential belief undergirded the Northern commitment to free labor and won the market revolution much widespread acceptance. By late 1856 and early 1857, anti-slavery leaders had begun hailing Fremont's defeat as a glorious one and looked ahead to the party's future successes. For those still in slavery or hoping to see loved ones freed, the news of Fremont's defeat was of course much harder to take. The Republican Party had promised the rise of an anti-slavery coalition, but voters rebuked it. The lessons seemed clear enough. The situation in Bleeding Kansas continued to loom large over national developments, darkening the national mood. Rumors and misinformation surrounding the early votes in the territory had long plagued the situation on the ground there. In 1856, these concerns became exacerbated as new stories emerged detailing the ways in which pro-slavery partisans from Missouri had again crossed the border to tamper with the Kansas elections. Back in 1854, critics attacked the Pierce administration for not living up to the ideals of popular sovereignty by ensuring fair elections. By 1856, few could look to the situation surrounding the ongoing votes in Kansas with any kind of confidence. The sectional crisis had at last become a national crisis. Bleeding Kansas was the first place to demonstrate that the sectional crisis could easily be, and in fact already was, exploding into a full-blown national crisis. As the national mood grew increasingly grim, Kansas attracted hundreds of armed militants from around the country, and their swelling numbers brought together the extreme sides of the slavery debate. In the days after the 1856 presidential election, meanwhile, newly elected President James Buchanan made his plans for his time in office clear. He talked with Chief Justice Roger Taney on Inauguration Day about a court decision he hoped to see handled during his time in office. Indeed, not long after the inauguration, the Supreme Court handed down a decision that would come to define Buchanan's presidency. The Dred Scott decision, Scott v. Sanford, ruled that Black Americans could not be citizens of the United States, and therefore could be transported as chattel from any state to another, regardless of state law. This gave the Buchanan administration and its Southern allies a direct repudiation of the Missouri Compromise. The court ruled that Scott, a Missouri slave, had no right to sue in U.S. courts. The Dred Scott decision signaled that the federal government was now fully committed to extending slavery as far and as wide as it might want. The Dred Scott decision seemed to settle the sectional crisis by making slavery fully national. But in reality, it just exacerbated sectional tensions further. In 1857, Buchanan sent U.S. military forces to subdue Utah's Mormon communities. This action, however, led to renewed charges, many of them leveled from within his own party, that the administration was abusing its powers. Far more important than the Utah invasion, however, were the ongoing events in Kansas. It was Kansas that at last proved to many Northerners that the sectional crisis would not go away unless slavery also went away. The Illinois Senate race in 1858 put the scope of the sectional crisis on full display. Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln challenged the greatly influential Democrat Stephen Douglas. Pandering to appeals to white supremacy, Douglas hammered the Republican opposition as a black Republican party bent on racial equality. The Republicans, including Lincoln, fired back with warnings of divisiveness and assertions that all Americans deserved equality of opportunity, even as they assured white audiences that they were no abolitionist party by yelling, "White Republicans!" Whenever Democrats offered their favorite attack line, Democrats hung on as best they could, but the Republicans won the House of Representatives and picked up seats in the Senate. Lincoln, despite the good news for his party, lost his contest with Stephen Douglas that fall. But in the process, Lincoln firmly established himself as a leading national Republican. After the 1858 elections, all eyes turned to 1860. Given the Republican Party's successes since 1854, it was expected that the 1860 presidential election might just produce the nation's first anti-slavery president. The year 1859 opened to a nation carefully navigating a crossroads moment in its history. In the troubled decades since the Missouri Compromise, the nation seemed to grow increasingly intent on tearing itself apart. As we have seen, congressmen clubbed each other nearly to death on the floor of Congress, and blood was now regularly being poured out in the war taking place on the Kansas and Missouri plains. Across the country, cities and towns were in various stages of revolt against federal authority. Fighting spread even farther against Native Americans in the far west and against Mormons in Utah. The nation's militants anticipated a coming breakdown and worked to exploit it. John Brown, a radical abolitionist who had been active in the movement for decades, moved east from Kansas with plans to escalate his assault on the slave system. Assembling a team from across the West, including black radicals from Oberlin, Ohio, and throughout communities in Western Canada, Brown hatched a plan to attack Harper's Ferry, a federal weapons arsenal in Virginia. Brown and his cohorts would then use the weapons to lead a revolt of enslaved people. Brown also approached and tried to recruit Frederick Douglass to the raid, though Douglass refused to join. Brown's raid began on October 16. By October 18, a command under Robert E. Lee had crushed the revolt. Many of Brown's men, including his own sons, were killed, but Brown himself lived and was imprisoned. Brown prophesied while in prison that the nation's crimes would only be purged with blood. He went to the gallows in December 1859. Northerners made a stunning display of sympathy on the day of his execution. Southerners took their reactions to mean that the coming 1860 election would be, in many ways, a referendum on secession and disunion. Republicans wanted little to do with Brown and instead tried to portray themselves as moderates, opposed to both abolitionists and pro-slavery expansionists. In this climate, the parties opened their contest for the 1860 presidential election. The Democratic Party fared poorly as its Southern delegates revoted after its national convention at Charleston and ran their own candidate, Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. Hoping to field a candidate who might nonetheless manage to bridge the broken party's factions, the Democrats decided to meet again at Baltimore and nominated Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. The Republicans, meanwhile, held their boisterous convention in Chicago. The Republican platform made the party's anti-slavery commitments clear, also making wide promises to its white constituents, particularly Westerners, with the promise of new land, transcontinental railroads, and broad support of public schools. Point 36 Abraham Lincoln, a candidate few outside Illinois truly expected to win, nonetheless proved far less polarizing than the other names on the ballot. Lincoln won the nomination, and with the Democrats in disarray, Republicans knew their candidate, Lincoln, had a good chance of winning. For all of the problems that abolitionists had faced since their resurgence in the 1820s and 1830s, the movement was far from a failure as conservative anti-slavery politicians seized the movement mantle in the late 1850s. The prominence of African Americans in abolitionist organizations offered a powerful, if imperfect, model of interracial coexistence. And while radical immediatists always remained a minority, their efforts had also paved the way for the moderately anti-slavery Republican Party to gain traction. It is hard to imagine that Abraham Lincoln could have become president in 1860 without the ground prepared by anti-slavery advocates and without the presence of radical abolitionists against whom he could be cast as a moderate alternative, though it ultimately took a civil war to break the bonds of slavery in the United States. The evangelical moral compass of revivalist Protestantism provided motivation for these embattled abolitionists as well. At the head of a badly disjointed coalition, nonetheless, Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 contest on November 6, gaining just 40% of the popular vote and not a single Southern vote in the Electoral College. Within days, Southern states were organizing secession conventions. John J. Crittenden of Kentucky proposed a series of compromises, but a clear pro-Southern bias meant they had little chance of gaining Republican acceptance. Crittenden's plan promised renewed enforcement of the fugitive slave law and offered a plan to keep slavery in the nation's capital, Holt 37. Republicans, by late 1860, knew that the voters who had just placed them in power did not want them to cave on these points, and Southern states proceeded with their plans to leave the Union. On December 20, South Carolina voted to secede and issued its Declaration of the Immediate Causes. The declaration highlighted the failure of the federal government to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act over competing personal liberty laws in northern states. After the war, many Southerners claimed that secession was primarily motivated by a concern to preserve states' rights, but the primary complaint of the very first ordinance of secession listed the federal government's failure to exert its authority over the northern states. The year 1861 then saw the culmination of the secession crisis. Before he left for Washington, Lincoln told those who had gathered in Springfield to wish him well and that he faced a task greater than Washington's in the years to come. Southerners were also learning the challenges of forming a new nation. The seceded states grappled with internal divisions right away, as states with enslavers sometimes did not support the newly seceded states. In January, for example, Delaware rejected secession. But states in the lower South adopted a different course. The state of Mississippi seceded. Later in the month, the states of Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana also left the Union. By early February, Texas had also joined the newly seceded states. In February, Southerners drafted a constitution protecting slavery and named Jefferson Davis of Mississippi their president. Weeks after Abraham Lincoln's inauguration, rebels in the newly formed Confederate States of America opened fire on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Within days, Abraham Lincoln would demand 75,000 volunteers from the North to crush the rebellion. The American Civil War had begun. Section 6, conclusion. Slavery had long divided the politics of the United States. In time, these divisions became both sectional and irreconcilable. The first and most ominous sign of a coming sectional storm occurred over the 1819 debates surrounding the admission of the state of Missouri. As westward expansion continued, these fault lines grew even more ominous, particularly as the United States managed to seize even more lands from its war with Mexico. The country seems to teeter ever closer to a full-throated endorsement of slavery. But an anti-slavery coalition arose in the mid-1850s, calling itself the Republican Party. Eager to cordon off slavery and confine it to where it already existed, the Republicans won the presidential election of 1860 and threw the nation on the path to war. Throughout this period, the mainstream of the anti-slavery movement remained committed to a peaceful resolution of the slavery issue through efforts understood to foster the ultimate extinction of slavery in due time. But as the secession crisis revealed, the South could not tolerate a federal government working against the interests of slavery's expansion and decided to take a gamble on war with the United States. Secession, in the end, raised the possibility of emancipation through war, a possibility most Republicans knew, of course, had always been an option, but one they nonetheless hoped would never be necessary. By 1861, all bets were off, and the fate of slavery and of the nation depended on war.